Good morning. Still morning. Thank you all for joining us to talk about the two recessions and the policy response. I'm Bryce Covert. I'm a freelance journalist. I am joined by Jessica Fulton, Vice President of Policy at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, Jhumpa Bhattacharya, Co-President of the Maiden Collaborative, and Mike Consul, Director at the Roosevelt Institute. And we are going to kick things off, and then there'll be a Q&A after the panel for about 10 minutes. So, panel, let's just talk, let's start out pretty broadly on this topic and talk about the important differences between what we went through in the Great Recession and the pandemic, and especially, and most importantly, what the responses were like from the government, responding to the Great Recession and responding to the pandemic recession. What were they like? And in your mind, what were the things that were done differently that we should really pay attention to? Jessica, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I can kick us off. We're starting broad, but my focus at the Joint Center is very specific. We focus on what's going on with Black communities in the United States. And I think the thing that stands out to me is that this recovery happened much more quickly for Black workers than what happened during the Great Recession, right? So during the Great Recession, or following the Great Recession, it took about 10 years for the Black unemployment rate to return to its pre-pandemic or pre-recession low, right?
And Black women, it didn't return at all.
At all, right? Always left out there. And this time it took just about 3 years. And so I think that's that's the thing that's in my head as we should keep in mind that we can build a job-centered recovery that can be inclusive of Black workers in particular.
I mean, I'll say when I first saw this question, I was like, wait, what was the response of the government after the Great Recession? I don't remember because I don't think there really was a great one. And I think to me, just to build on what Jessica said, what was great is for the first time, at least in my adult life, there was a targeted response, right? Like people were not afraid. It felt like the government was finally saying, those who need the most help and those who have been marginalized, we are going to help you. And that is really different from trickle down economics. It's really different from even Clinton era, that gutting Social Security and or the safety net. It was like, no, we need to actually invest in people. And we're talking about people, essential workers, essential but not expendable, right? And so those are the things that I think really worked to help. Am I just really loud? Sorry. Really worked to help ensure that we had a more equitable recovery. And now we have the lowest Black unemployment rate in a very, very long time. It's still higher than white unemployment, so we have work to do. But again, it just showed you that when you do target your responses to those most in need, it works. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just add to all that, three specific points that really distinguish it from the Great Recession. One was they really aimed for the target of full employment. They aimed beyond where the economy was in 2019. There wasn't the theory that this was like a thin insurance to, make sure the worst outcome didn't happen and then things would get better on its own quite quickly. They really aimed for a full employment economy and have been delivering on that. Second is, maybe a little nuance, but I think it's important, is that there's a little bit of a political theory is that you think of the response to the Great Recession, there was always the thought that they could go back and get more stimulus to support the labor market. And they never really could. And the weak recovery really messed with the ability to deliver on climate legislation at the time. It stalled out a lot of things with the Affordable Care Act, and crucially set the tone for so-called deficit reduction and austerity in the subsequent years, where they were trying to get short-term funding in exchange for long-term cuts. And the long-term funding was really important to help people, but the long-term cuts were unnecessary and quite brutal. Here, they solved full employment in the first 3 or 4 months of their administration, and then could put their full attention on trying to pass what the Build Back Better package, which huge political things, a lot of things happened with that. But there was no if unemployment was 2 or 3 points higher or 5 points higher, think about how much harder that would be. And then last, and something we'll be talking about for the rest of the panel, is just a lot more broader administrative action. The Obama team had a lot of tools to deal with the housing market, for instance, for trying to stop foreclosures that they didn't try or didn't try very much of, where there's a much more whole administrative approach baked into the ARP and the subsequent actions that were taken.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting, Jumpa, that you say you like kind of don't remember what happened in response to the Great Recession. And I think that is very telling. A lot happened in response to the pandemic recession. And I wonder if you guys can highlight what pieces of it you thought were most important or effective, particularly for potentially Black workers or just generally reaching the most vulnerable and keeping them whole. Like in your mind, what worked or was really significant?
I was really impressed with the focus on keeping money in people's pockets, right? So our government really stepped up to supplement unemployment insurance, to pass the expansion of the child tax credit so that people actually had money in their pockets that otherwise would not have qualified to get that credit at all, right? So kind of the folks who are at the lowest end of our income spectrum. The focus on the pause on student loan payments, which I know like the pause on student loan payments that we're about to see change in a bit, right? But keeping money in folks' pockets, I think, was really the big thing that I think we saw that we haven't really seen that before.
I mean, to me, like what the pandemic did is that it shown what a lot of us had already known for a very long time, particularly poor Black and brown people knew that the economy wasn't working, right? Nobody wanted to go back to normal because normal was not working for most of us, right? But what we were having is a government response that was like, oh my God, this is a crisis. And so we need to do things like put money in people's pockets. And there wasn't the political backlash that you would normally have, right? But we have been in crisis for a very, very long time. And we're still in crisis, right? The fact that we have poverty, which is a policy choice, is a crisis moment. And so we can't rest on our laurels because there's still so much work to do. And yes, there's a lot of good things that happened, but they have ended and they're sunsetting, just like the student loan payment. And this is our charge now, right? How do we continue to push and organize? What we saw happen during the pandemic is organizing helped us see that those in most need, again, needed help and they needed money. And it worked. It worked. So we can't let those lessons just lie, right? We need to now build and keep building and keep building, keep pushing.
And I think there was a focus on this crisis happened and it's not the fault of these folks who are affected, right? Like we're going to do something about it. And I think that's something that we don't see when we think about like, how is racism affecting folks? How is sexism affecting folks? Like these are not the fault of individuals that they're not able to get a leg up.
It's like a hint of a systemic, right, approach, but versus blaming people for their problems. Yeah.
And one thing I'd add and emphasize is the expanded unemployment insurance that was originally part of the CARES Act in March 2020. One that's just noteworthy that I don't think there's been a good history of this written yet, but it's the result of essentially a couple, maybe a half dozen Democratic staffers who pushed for that. And within the fast moving package that became the CARES Act, and Mnuchin and their team went along with it. And fundamentally, I think changed political economy over the subsequent 5 years or however long it's been, 3 years, it feels like 5, but 3.5 years, and we'll continue on, right? But the fact that you had unemployment insurance that was particularly disproportionately targeted towards low-income workers, that they were receiving essentially over their income, that it was extended to people who are not traditionally covered by unemployment insurance, the result of a lot of people putting a lot of light on the so-called fissured workplace.
Thank you,
I thank you, I too. You look at the recovery we've had in the labor market where wage growth has been particularly strong in the bottom half of the income distribution. There's been huge wage compression. And in particular, services have seen very strong income growth. I think that would not have happened as well as it did without the UI basis from 2020 and 2021.
I'd also love to talk about some of the shortfalls of the pandemic response because it was very different than the Great Recession response, but was not perfect and was also happening in a crisis. And so things were sort of getting slapped together. Were there groups that were not reached? Were there programs that did not stand up well? What were the parts of this response that could have gone further or could have gone better?
Okay, I'll start. Here's the thing. We attempted to do something within an infrastructure and systems that are inherently not built right? To help Black people in particular, and then by virtue, other people of color, right? And so it's really a square peg circle. What is it? What's the square peg round hole? Yeah, kind of situation, right? And so you have all of this money coming to local municipalities, local governments for housing assistance, let's say, right? But I know in the Bay, I'm from Oakland. There was a lot of money that was untouched in Oakland. Also, there was like, how do we get these to the folks that need it the most? Folks that don't speak English as a first language, right? So many, I know, like in Chinatown, so many Chinese immigrants didn't know how to access the portal, or the portal was completely messed up and they couldn't do it, or things were translated wrong, right? So we don't have an infrastructure in place to actually reach the communities that we need. And so this is why implementation is really, really important. And we need to build, because again, we live in a society that has systems and institutions that are inherently anti-Black, that are inherently patriarchal and sexist, and we can't expect these very systems to magically change overnight, right? And that's just a reality. So this is the type of work that we need to do to ensure that resources that are coming in are actually getting to the folks on the ground that need them.
In retrospect, and I don't know the answer to it, but the fact that the child tax credit was not anchored better, it reduced poverty by 50%, or reduced childhood poverty by 50% in 2021, was a real important transformation of family policy and care policy, but it was not anchored in a way that allowed it to be politically sustained. I don't think we have a good answer on why that is, but decisions made in the American Rescue Plan probably contributed to that, and we really need to figure that out. I will say, some people, some not in this room, but outside critics will criticize the state and local spending is excessive, and particularly captured by Republican governors who used it for tax cuts, essentially. But a lot of it, and this was very unique, was sent to municipalities and cities, which did a lot of innovative trial work on policies. And we will see what comes out of some of those in the years ahead, because I think that did make a big difference. We are now finally seeing a recovery in state and local government employment, which had been lagging, but is now finally starting to pick up some steam. And I don't think you would have seen that without that funding in place.
And I think I agree with both of those. And to add, I think one of the things that's really frustrating for me is the lack of protection for our essential workers, or the folks, the folks doing the work that really kept the economy running, largely Black and brown workers, people literally putting their lives on the line so that like I could order food, right? Like to my door, like that. And that's an issue. And I think that there was an opportunity there to really show up for the people that keep our economy going, and we missed it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll ask another broad question, because you're already starting to hint to the fact that we're now in a different place, right? These things are either have ended or are ending. Maybe I'll start on the positive note of like, what do you think is the lasting change? Have you seen changes in thinking or in the way things are done that you think will outlive the pandemic response, or is most of it just going back to the norm?
I mean, there's a strong force, right, for us to like want to go back. We saw that with the debt ceiling catastrophe, right? And I think, we have to talk about the pandemic happened, so did George Floyd. Like these two things happened at the same time, which just erupted a whole new movement, right? New to many people, recharged some of us, some others of us, right? And so we're also seeing a backlash to that, though, right? So like there was all of a sudden you've got Nike and all the companies and people kneeling with their kente cloths on and all the stuff, right, happening after George Floyd, and people not being afraid to say anti-Black. All of a sudden, I wasn't the only person on a panel talking about anti-Blackness, but now we're seeing the like pushback to that, and we're seeing the anti-CRT stuff, and we're seeing like you can't say gay and you can't talk about slavery. Like what's happening, right? So this is why, like it's the pendulum, it's the sine curve. I don't know if I'm answering your question, Bryce, but this is what is coming to me in this moment is like, I think we have to stay even more vigilant, because all of those things that happened that were good are going to be taken away from us. Because again, that is kind of where we want to go as a society. We want to keep blaming people for their problems, right? Instead of taking a systemic look at what's actually happening. We need to really think about diagnosing the problem correctly. And we're still not doing that. We're still not doing that.
I think I'm really optimistic, hopeful, maybe, that the folks who maybe just recently kind of entered these conversations will keep pushing, right? Because there are folks who have been fighting these fights for decades, that have been working on racial equity issues, that were working on the policies that we were able to implement, like during the recovery, that like they didn't necessarily have a ton of friends fighting alongside, right? Like it was a problem
Right.
to come and talk about anti-Blackness. People were just kind of like,
Yeah, no, like literally.
yeah. And so I think I'm really hopeful that folks stay in the fight and understand that you don't win against a battle that's been going on for hundreds of years in 3 years, right? Like we're not done. We're still working on these issues and we still need to keep pushing.
I mean, the fact that I'm here at UConn talking about anti-Blackness is a big win. Like, let's just be real about that. It is.
It is.
I'd also add there's a big proof of concept of what happened. So, as people brought up, like there's the reaction moment's happening right now. It's happening about the recovery. It's happening across anti-Blackness, and it's happening across many things, GLBTQ issues notably. However, we were able to demonstrate that like childhood poverty is a choice. Like we can eliminate childhood poverty. We can eliminate it by half easily. We can eliminate it entirely. That is a policy variable we are choosing to do or not do. The employment rate, how strong the economy is. The thing that keeps jumping out at me is that both employment and labor force participation, a lot of different ways of measuring how many workers there would be, is higher now than what projections were before the pandemic. There are more people employed. There's a very long debate over the last 20 years pre-pandemic about what to do with all the missing workers. A lot of people were dropping out of the labor force over the 2000s. And a lot of people said, this is about
They were pushed out. They
Yeah.
weren't
Video games.
They were pushed out.
video games. But people just said, well, this is about demand. This is about Federal Reserve policy. This is about stimulus. And we were right. The numbers are back to 2001 levels, and they'll probably exceed the highest level, which was in the late 90s, if things continue in the next couple months.
Yeah, so where do we go from here? I mean, I think specifically to start out, a lot of these were policies implemented in a crisis mindset to try to, stem the bleeding, basically. But what of these are things that we should be thinking about not in times of crisis? The economy is pretty healthy right now, and hopefully we're not going to hit another pandemic soon. Are there policies that were done that you would point to that should not be disappearing, that we should be thinking about at all times, not just times of crisis?
The support for workers, the support for families that we saw, the way we were able to avoid a foreclosure and eviction wave in something that would have, in normal or without any intervention, would have absolutely caused a wave of foreclosures and evictions, can be not necessarily at that scale we need it necessarily. It's actually a few things we can do locally or state levels that can really, slow down those. The general level of protection that was put in a crisis can absolutely be extended. And whether or not, because we think a lot about like, the big fiscal, like all the spending that was going on, but there was also that layer of extra protections to keep people secure that could be extended at all times.
I mean, I'm just going to, like I said this at the top, like, I think we're still in crisis. We are still in crisis. And I think, we can look at one number, the GDP, we can look at a number like unemployment and feel good about that. But then we also have the conversation about what is the quality of the job that people have? Is the job that they have, or are the jobs that they have, because many people have to work multiple jobs just to make ends meet, is it allowing them to live a life of dignity and get to their full potential? And I don't think that that's what we have right now, right? And so, Bryce, I know I'm just going to ask the question to myself that you put out on Twitter. It's like, well, we know what's happening. We know there's a childcare crisis, but we also know that women are returning to the workforce. So what's going on? And so you can look at something like, well, women are returning to the workforce, so all is good. But that's not the full story, right? And this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about crisis. It's women have been forced to figure out childcare because that's what we do. That's what we've been forced to do. But like, to what end? So I'm going to share the story. We did some work down in Mississippi, looking at barriers to employment. And we were looking specifically at Black workers and what's happening in Mississippi with Black workers, a huge project, obviously. But this one woman was talking in our focus groups, a Black woman was talking about how she could not find childcare for her young person, right? And she had to go to work, obviously, to make ends meet and work requirements and all the things in Mississippi. So what she ended up doing, she was so desperate, what she ended up doing for her small child is she would drop her child off at Walmart. Why? It is climate controlled. It has a bathroom. She gave him money for food. You could, you can get food there, and there's like TVs and like things that you can play with. That's what she had to do. She was in tears telling us, but that is how desperate we have made it because we refuse to think about care and childcare as something that we need to invest in and put resources in, yet we expect people to work. Right? We have these policies that are based on one person stays at home, the woman, another person goes out and is a breadwinner, the man, and that is not the reality of our society today, and our policies have not caught up with that, right? And so I really want to say we are still in crisis, and we have to look beyond the top numbers and see the lived experiences of what's actually happening on the ground to understand what's happening with our economy right now.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, this is sort of like an easy answer to what needs to remain, but like we need to just expand the child tax credit. Like this is silly. We're doing a very silly thing by allowing children to be in poverty. We know what the benefits are. We know that there are short-term benefits in terms of like their household economic well-being, but like we know that there are long-term benefits to children not living in poverty. And
Do you have optimism, or do you find ways to give yourself some optimism or organize toward this, that the lessons learned in the pandemic may not be lost? Policy response, that we won't just forget what we did, that we won't sort of memory hold the fact that we erased so much child poverty, that we helped see people through an acute drop in employment. I guess, where do you see us going from here? And do you feel hopeful? Do you see people working on it? Do you think there's organizing there to keep this going?
Okay, I'll start. This is a question about hope, right? So I took my son, so I'm here with my kid. We made a whole DC trip out of this conference. And we took him to the African American Museum yesterday, right? And as we were walking through it, you go through slavery, and then you go through the civil rights era, and then you go through kind of times now. And like I'm walking my kid through this, he's 9, and I was like dreading him asking me, Mama, things have changed though, right? Like things are better for Black people now, right? And I was like, I hope he doesn't ask me this question, because honestly, like I walked through the Emmett Till exhibit, and I was like, okay, here was a 14-year-old who went to the grocery store and then was killed, brutally killed. A couple of months ago, a young Black man went to the wrong door to pick up his brother and was shot in the head. How far have we actually come? And this to me is exactly what we should be talking about when we're talking about the economy, because we are the economy, and how Black people are doing is relevant to talking about the economy, right? And so I was like, honestly, I was so nervous. And then we ended at the Afrofuturism exhibit. And what I loved about the Afrofuturism exhibit is that it is all about tapping into creativity and imagination and joy. And that's what brings me hope, right? Because there is so much that we can do when we actually have imaginative leaders that are like, we are done with the status quo, because the status quo was not made for us. It was not made for us. It was actually made to suppress us. So we need to be imaginative, and we need to be thinking outside the box, the square, the universe, all of those things. And that happens when you center joy, and when you center love, and when you center creativity, right? So I'll say, like, we were able to do this in California. I'm part of a coalition called Debt Free Justice California. And we do work around the harmful impacts of mass incarceration. We leaned in, like we were like, you know what? California is going to become the first state to abolish administrative fees within the criminal legal system. We're going to do it. And that took imagination, and it took courage. And a lot of people told us we couldn't do it. And especially don't talk about race, but we did it anyway. And we had an organizing effort behind it. And what did that result in? Over 8 billion with a B, like, booyah, we did that, right? $8 billion of debt was released for most of Black and brown Californians, right? Low-income Black and brown Californians. That's what happens when you tap into imagination. That's what happens when you tap into creativity and you reject the status quo. And that's what brings me hope.
I feel hopeful now.
No, I'm good. I'm glad.
I'll jump in actually with a follow-up. Do you think that either an economy where people are perhaps doing a little better than they had been before the pandemic, maybe with maybe a little bit more money in their pockets, maybe more people are employed, and or just experience of the pandemic where they could get unemployment insurance for the first time or they got a child tax credit? Do you think those things are, fomenting new or different kinds of thinking or organizing? Like, are you seeing that when you're talking to folks on the ground that they're thinking differently or organizing differently?
I mean, I think people saw the possibility, right, of what could happen when you gave people money, right? When you trusted people to make decisions for their families, where you didn't have all of these restrictions on this is how you can spend your TANF dollars. Is you can't buy diapers, but you can buy this. You can't buy this cheese. Like it's literally that difficult, right? But when you're just like, no, we trust you. Here's some money. We trust you to make the best decision for your families. And we don't do this because we inherently don't trust Black people with money. That's just that's the narrative, right? So, but what happens when we do trust people? And like, how did that feel? How did that feel when the government was like, no, we trust you to make the best decision in your family? Like people got a taste of that. Right. And I think that that's what we have to keep doing because it worked. Like we cut poverty in half. It worked. And so to me, we have to keep leaning into folks understanding how government can be good. Because honestly, for a lot of Black and brown people, when you say, hey, the government can help you, you're met with a lot of skepticism. Rightly so. But this was a moment where actually things did go well for a lot of folks. And so I think we have to keep going on that.
All right, Jessica and Mike,
know.
back to the question, which is just, where are we going from here? And do you think some lessons were learned either at like the grassroots level or at the policy level? Like, are people going to think differently coming out of the pandemic, or are we going to walk all this back and forget it ever happened?
I'll jump in first. I actually think it's up in the air. I don't think the full story of this recovery has been fully written yet. I think it's important that people in communities, people in this room, electeds, others really emphasize the positives of it because there's a lot of people who are opposed to it. They're opposed to it for a variety of different reasons. Some justified, some quite not. And I think, I think it is open the lessons we take from the things and the innovations that were done. I don't think we're going to go fully back, but I want to go I don't want to just take this as a baseline. I want to be able to move the ball forward, already pocketing what we've been able to accomplish here and understanding those things going forward. So I'd say it's important that we keep trying to figure out what happened and emphasizing, even things like you look at the way HUD changed housing policy on the fly. You think of all these innovations that were taking place at local levels using ARP money to tackle real problems. You look at the way those are going to intersect with the money that's going to roll off the Inflation Reduction Act. I think the story of the economy in this moment is right now really being written by the financial press, which is emphasizing inflation, and all the everyday people whose lives are better, particularly Black and brown communities, are not getting their say in the story. And I think it's really important we're able to emphasize that.
Yeah, I would say there's an opportunity really to think about the innovations that happen with the ARP money and understand the impacts there. I don't think we really know. I don't think we really know from the experiments that have happened across the country, things like guaranteed income pilot programs. Like we don't actually know the impacts of those yet. And I think there's an opportunity there to learn about what worked and what didn't work and figure out how to scale it up. I would also say I think there is a little bit of like people are already trying to push back against the things that have happened, right? And so I think I am really hopeful that folks are noticing, like these are the people that are speaking out against the things that actually benefited you 12 months ago, right? They're already saying we don't actually, as you said, like people don't trust Black folks with money. We didn't want you to have this support, right? And so figuring out how to build more power around those kinds of conversations, I think it's really important because there are very clear villains, right, in this story, and there's an opportunity to push forward that way.
I want to ask about the politics of all of this. I mean, on the one hand, I was struck by how bipartisan a lot of this was. The CARES Act was completely bipartisan, signed by Trump, but also in a crisis moment. American Rescue Plan, party line, and now perhaps we're in a different political moment when it comes to all these things. Like, where do you see both sides, both progressives and conservatives? Like, what are the politics like here? Is there hope that a similar coalition comes together to support these kinds of things, or is that bipartisanship just poof, gone with the smoke?
I'd flag two things. Let's kind of take the negative case. One is that COVID impacted everyone, not equally at all, but rich white people saw themselves vulnerable. Business leaders saw themselves vulnerable. I'm reminded of when they were actually passing the CARES Act in March 2020. People, our senators are a bit older, and we knew it was vulnerable to older people, and people did not want to stand around and debate the finer points of unemployment insurance. They wanted to get quarantined because no one knew how it was spreading. So I think that's actually a secret reason the bill was so good is that people were really afraid they were going to die, and so they just said pass it. We don't want to come back here. That's again the full reporting is not done on this, but and so you contrast it with the Great Recession, which became very racialized very quickly. It was not about banks making irresponsible loans that they could then package into fraudulent products. It was Black and brown communities and Hispanic communities taking out irresponsible loans. The Tea Party was originally not an anti-deficits party, it was an anti-homeowner relief party. And that did not happen that same way. The politics of that in 2020 did not play out that same way. That's why I think it's really important we emphasize the benefits that took place, the things that really got money in support to communities and to people and the families, the things that could have been done better to support, particularly on care, the things we did that sadly are not being done anymore, like the child tax credit, to make sure that the benefits of doing things aggressively and strong can outweigh whatever the more reactionary politics will be on whatever the next thing that happens.
I mean, I don't know. Okay, I'm not a DC person, clearly, and I just don't care about bipartisanship if it means throwing the people that I care about under the bus. I just don't. I just don't care. Sorry, like the goal for us to be something bipartisan is just so like ethereal and like who cares, right? If like literal people are dying or if it means that we're going to have to cave in on work requirements, which everybody should know do not work. We have all the evidence in the world. But like, again, we are not diagnosing the problem correctly. And so we're getting to solutions that are band-aid solutions to things that need a tourniquet, right? So who cares if something is bipartisanship or not? What I care about is what is the impact it's going to have on the people that need it the most. And if something has to be passed with a supermajority or it's just the progressives that do it, fantastic. Because what needs to happen in the end is that we are in a desperate need of a new paradigm. Right. And so we talked a lot about neoliberalism, but we don't know what the new thing is yet. Right. We haven't actually named, we aren't visioning, we aren't given the time in the nonprofit industry to sit. We're constantly reacting. But can we be proactive and think about what is the thing that we want to create? So going back to the Afrofuturism exhibit, right? What is a world that is centered around imagination and Black joy and love and creativity? What does that look like? What does that feel like? What does that taste like? Let's like have that imagination, right? And it doesn't mean when I talk about centering Blackness, I'm not saying centering Blackness to the exclusion of all others. That is white supremacist thinking. That is white supremacy. But we don't have to have another social hierarchy. It doesn't mean Black people at the top and everyone else at the bottom. That's not what I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for something completely different. Again, to tap into our imaginations, to imagine a world that is truly equitable. And so I think for that to happen, we have to let go of these old tendencies to be like, but it was bipartisan and like, oh, we came to a deal and compromise. Why? We shouldn't have to do that. And I know this is not a popular opinion to say in DC. This is why I'm not ever going to be working on the Hill or in DC. But I think you need people like me to remind folks that maybe our North Star shouldn't be that, but it should be about how do we actually build a society that helps everyone.
Yeah, and I think if what's going on in state politics is any indication of what will happen moving forward, then I'm not at all hopeful that like thinking about bipartisan solutions as the opportunity to protect vulnerable communities is the right approach. But the Joint Center is a nonprofit organization. We're a 501c3, and I'm not talking about politics necessarily. I do feel that one of the things that we've run into and that we're really concerned about is a lot of the implementation of the CHIPS, IIJA and IRA goes down to the states to distribute to communities in their states, right? And so what we're really concerned about and what we're really paying attention to is what happens in those states, in particular, some of the states in the South where the state governments are not necessarily in line or interested in supporting Black communities, right? And so, like, what happens when we pass this great legislation and then it doesn't ever reach the communities that we really care about?
Like with chips, right? Like, yes, the childcare provision is great, but who are you going to be providing that to? Is it only going to be full-time workers? Because guess who get part-time work, temporary work, never get hired to be full-time workers? It's Black and brown women mostly, right? And so if childcare provisions isn't going to reach them, then we did it wrong, right? So I mean, those are the types of things that we need to be thinking about.
As Mike said, it feels a little bit like we're in a moment where the history is being written and we don't know exactly which way we're going. How do we hold on to the lessons of what happened? How do we make sure that people remember that we can solve child poverty, that we can put money in people's pockets? Like, how do we make sure that that just doesn't get forgotten?
Write reports.
White papers.
Oh my God, you did not just say that. No, we can't be just writing reports. We have to be organizing, and we have to be telling the stories of, like, again, how did this impact people on the ground? How do we keep telling those stories and getting those people involved in politics, right? So it's not enough to just tell the story, but how are we engaging with folks who for all the reasons are not engaged because nobody wanted them engaged. Like, let's be real, right? So I think we have to, again, just keep showing the impact that it's had and organizing and bringing in people into our fight. And yeah, I think that's the way to do it, honestly.
I think there's also a piece, and I'm curious to hear y'all's thoughts on this. Like, you also have to acknowledge that this didn't really go far enough for a lot of people, right? And so, like, we did a survey that was about, like, how has your financial situation improved in the past 12 months? And most people are like, it was okay. Like, 20% of Black folks said that their financial situation got better in the past 12 months, which means that, like, people aren't feeling something.
That's the thing. We keep saying the economy is great, and people are like, is it?
We have to
Right? Yeah.
acknowledge it.
Right. Well, Mike, I mean, since you look at the numbers, what do you make of that? Because we do have on paper a strong economy, but I think all throughout this period, Black people, but also a lot of Americans have felt like not optimistic, not in a very stable position. Like, is there a disconnect? Is there more that needs to be done? Are there parts of the numbers that are sort of covering over bigger cracks?
Yeah, so I don't think we have a good handle on necessarily why the numbers are so bad on the economy. We do know that inflation is much higher than people expected. There's going to be a panel later this afternoon about that. You can check out, but we can talk about it a little bit here. Inflation is a global phenomena. It's very tied to the fact that we had to shut down and reopen the economy at the same time that there was a land war in Eastern Asia that really impacted global food and energy markets that we're still only now really getting out from under. There's really big wage boosts in the bottom half of the income distribution, but not everyone's working full time. And so people who are not, kind of feel the impact of that. A lot of our social safety net programs are not really adjusted for inflation, or at least not in a good way. So that means that a lot of, like Social Security workers or people on Social Security have a good boost, but people who are on income support don't necessarily have that. And there's also a complicated political question, which I don't think we've solved yet, but that, you see wages really strong in the bottom half of the income distribution, wages very strong for service workers. But a lot of people in our economy, especially a lot of white upper middle class people, purchase a lot of services and they notice that they're more expensive. And that's a political challenge about what do we do when we have a more empowered service economy. Some workers are unionizing, there's a lot of work to be done there, but that's a political challenge I don't think we've really wrapped our heads around yet. That a booming economy for workers will impact a lot of people in a way that's not necessarily great for our coalition. Some of that work can be really rationalized, like, say, having a actual industrial policy for care policy.
Exactly.
That would help a lot of people quite dramatically. But yeah, a lot of the fallout from that is not always politically great, but it's economically just that we have service workers who are empowered and have organization in their workplace.
Well, and then there was a historically tight labor market, which we don't tend to see in this country. And then the running line was people are quitting and no one wants to work. So, there's like an immediate backlash, it seems like. All right, I'm gonna open it up to Q&A. And I think that, are we passing a mic? Is that, yeah. So there's gonna be a mic for you to speak into so everyone, particularly if there's folks at home, can hear you. We can start with Kate, who had her hand up first.
Thank you. And I don't think I could think of a better panel for this conversation. It's been really great. So I'm glad you all are here having this conversation. And I think probably every one of you knows me well enough to guess what I'm going to ask about, which is worker power. Sort of what is the role of worker power, and particularly in shaping public investment? This is not a comment, so I'm not going to, I have opinions. I'm not going to say that, but I really want to know what you all think about the role of worker power, both unions, non-traditional worker organizations, and in particular, sort of making sure that some of these convergences in wages, decline in the black-white unemployment gap are baked in.
Go for it.
Yes. So we've been thinking a lot about specifically where Black workers are left out of labor protections in particular, and the opportunity to build more worker power more broadly. And I think as it relates to the COVID-19 recovery, the place that I think about that most is in essential work, right? So thinking about care workers, thinking about people in service industries, and thinking about how they're able to shift in the way that we think about whether or not certain workers deserve certain protections and higher wages and the kinds of benefits that we know people need to just basically get by. And so I think there is a lot of opportunity in the next couple years, I'm hoping, to make some real shifts in how the market works for Black workers in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to break down what do we mean when we're talking about worker power, right? What we're talking about is people being able to have their basic needs met, to go to a job that isn't going to kill them, literally, right? Because it's a dangerous, unsanitary job, and that they have some kind of control over their lives. And right now, that's not what happens. Most workers do not have control over their lives, particularly Black and brown ones, particularly Black and brown women. And we have to also understand the narratives that drive our workforce our workforce policies are deeply sexist and deeply racist, right? And so that's why we don't care about care work, because traditionally that was forced upon by Black women to do. Now we have immigrant women doing it, and lots of Black and brown women doing it. But again, it is something that we devalue, right? And so worker power for me is that isn't a reality anymore, that all work is seen as is all the same, right? That we're taking away the racist and the sexist notions that we have around work. And I think that is such an important thing for us to keep thinking about, is worker power is about people being able to have their basic human rights met. And I think if we're coming from that part of the conversation and we are talking about changing balances of power, that's exciting to me, and that's a must. Because if we don't do that, yeah, we're going to go right back to where we were before. And that's not what we want. We don't want to have this conversation, this EconCon, in 10 years. It should be a completely different conversation if we're doing it right.
I agree with all that. And I'd add that there is a tension between talking about full employment, which is an important part of this recovery, and more structural change, right? Because on one hand, full employment is bringing up the employment to population ratio. It's increasing the number of people who are working, but we know that in order to really have more equitable access to jobs, we need care policy. That's why our numbers are so far behind other countries. We know that service workers and a lot of workers at the bottom end of the income distribution are having much higher wage gains. But in order to solidify that, we need, and there is union campaigns ongoing, but in order to do that, we also need more structural labor law reform and other kinds of labor boards and other kinds of interventions. The way I think about the trade-off is that when we're not near full employment, or at least not approaching it, when we're in a period of austerity and output gaps and high unemployment, that forces us to be a lot more zero sum. that forces politics, not us, but like politics becomes a lot more zero sum. We saw that in the Obama years. A lot more like there's not enough to go around, and so if you're getting something, I'm losing it. Where full employment and having the kind of abundance that can come with a lot of output and a lot of jobs, at least can short circuit that a little bit, or at least push back on it a little bit. That can open up some space for other political campaigns to make those structural changes.
Yeah. And I think in the investments in industrial policy, I think there's an opportunity there to kind of shift how we talk about who should benefit from dollars to manufacturing jobs, right? And so like we know that Black workers and Black communities were devastated by the loss of manufacturing jobs. They are never centered in those conversations. We never talk about Black job loss in factories, right? Like, and so I think there is a real opportunity to change how we're talking about where the investments that the Biden-Harris administration is making in communities, where those should go. And I want to be like, I don't think we're talking about this. We're not talking about it in a way that I think that we should be in terms of racial equity when it comes to industrial policy.
Hi, my name is Joseph Torres. I work for a public interest group called Free Press, a media and telecom policy, but also on a project called Media 2070, fighting for media reparations. So, I mean, Jumpa, when you said targeted policies and working in DC for the past, I don't know, 2 decades now, you know, I think the so-called progressive left has gotten better at framing issues. This is going to hurt Black and brown folks and stuff like that, right? But when it comes to actual policies, you can't address race, and I don't believe that's true. Meanwhile, the right is addressing race and gender and all of its policies, and somehow it's so far meeting constitutional scrutiny. It seems like, right? It's not like being, it's like, and just to be honest, there's too many lawyers and stuff like that who lead movements, and it makes the movements weaker. No offense to lawyers here, but it's not their training. It's not their training to be movement leaders. But that's who the foundations give money to policies to do the policy work. So, all right, I stopped that statement. But say targeted. Just keep talking about targeting. How can you target? Can you target race? How do you just talk? If you could talk about that, like, can you not target race when it comes to policies? How do you target race? And how do you, because I just see folks totally avoiding. They could talk about impacts on Black and brown people, but then the policies doesn't match what they're trying to solve. So I'll stop there.
This is a great question. So there are movement lawyers, just so you know. There are movement lawyers. They are out there, and they are ready to change the stuff. So, okay, I do a lot of work around guaranteed income. California has 5 million pilots, as does a lot of other places in the country. And we talk about this a lot, right? Because at this point, most of the guaranteed income pilots have been privately funded and can talk about targeting, right? And we get into this, I'm looking at Sadia, we're like, we get into this conversation around, well, when public dollars are brought into the picture, how do we target? Because it can't, there is a legal reasons why it can't. And so I'm like, we got to change the law. That's where the next organizing fight is. We have to change the law. Because what was the law intended to do that they cite? Right, that says that you can't target by race. It was intended to actually uplift Black people. That was the original intention of the law. But now it's being used against us. And so I'm like, we got to change it. That's what I think. That's where we have to go. Because until we do that, we can't. You're right. We're going to get stuck with the legality of having a targeted guaranteed income based on race. We can do it based on class, which is a proxy, quite frankly. But I think we need to change the narrative around that. And we need to have honest conversations about race in this country. We do not know how to talk about race in this country, right? We know how to talk about it in all the bad ways, but we don't know how to have productive, honest conversations about race and anti-Blackness in this country by design. And it's getting worse because of the anti-CRT movement, right? And so this is the fight that we have to change that law, and we have to learn and do some reconciliation and talk about, get comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's what we have to do.
And I think in terms of, I'm not a lawyer. I also think that there is something that we need to be, the Supreme Court is going to come down with a decision on these affirmative action cases sometime this month. And I think that there will be people who will try to stretch the implications of their ruling beyond higher education, right? And so I don't think that it's going to get better. I think it's going to get worse. And I think that, and I think we need to be really careful in crafting a strategy to make sure that we don't lose more ground on the things that we have gotten that have been able to be targeted, right? Like there's very little, but there's something, and we need to try to hold on to that.
Hi, thank you. Should I stand? All right. Charlie Ellsworth, and I just can't say how happy I am to hear this panel, and thank you so much to Jessica and Jumpa and Mike. I was really fortunate to be Leader Schumer's budget advisor during CARES and the rescue plan, and so this whole discussion about kind of formalizing what we went through during that time, I think is really important because I know we're going to have this spasm of Alzheimer's or dementia or whatever, as soon as we hit a recession in 6, 9 months or whatever, and we all forget to do whatever we did before. So I think really formalizing through even hearings, testimony, et cetera, the differences between the two recessions and just continuing these conversations is really important. So acknowledging that, yes, we are still in a state of crisis with childcare and we didn't deliver for frontline workers, totally agree. I want to think about how can we tee up the response for the next recession, and maybe it's not the 1 in 6 months, but what I'm thinking about, long story short, is enhanced automatic stabilizers, ways to put into law the response that we would all like to have if we face these set of circumstances again. And we talk about UI and SNAP and Medicaid and kind of some traditional benefits, but let's get creative. Like, what are some other enhanced stabilizers that we could think about including, and have you all given that any thought? And what are maybe some downsides of enhanced automatic stabilizers if you see them?
Yeah, to go back to an earlier question Bryce asked, like what are some of the downsides or what are some of the missed opportunities of the response, was the lack of more structural changes into unemployment insurance, into obviously the permanence of the CTC, but even before you get there, a more robust set of automatic stabilizers. And it would be good to know more of the history of why that failed. My understanding, a very obvious reason is that it's the way the budgeting rules work is that it scores as a lot of money. And because of the power the CBO has within the process, because of the power Democrats give the CBO in the legislative process, it's just another veto point in a system that has far too many veto points. We weren't able to get a lot of that stuff put in. So that to me is the biggest problem, is we need to kind of rethink the filibuster. We need to get rid of the filibuster, and we need to have a more nuanced sense of how budgeting rules should work for many of these programs that only would kick in when they fundamentally replace GDP and make the economy stronger, so that their budgetary rules are just not the same as they would be for just a generic spending program. And that's going to need leadership change. And the first step is getting rid of the filibuster, which would then make some of the other stuff more subsequently easy. That's a very technical read of the situation, but it's sadly, there's a great American Prospect issue about the power that budget models have, the CBO in particular has over legislation, and just the ability to like constrain the vision that was in things like this rapid recovery that I would recommend people check out, because I think that got to a lot of the problem.
One of the things that makes recession so devastating for Black communities is that Black households do not have wealth to withstand through kind of a situation where they have income volatility, right? So like if someone loses their job, there's sort of this really devastating impact on whether or not they're able to afford the basic things that they need to survive. And I think like figuring out how to shore up automatic stabilizers is really important, so that like people are still able to eat and people are able to get kind of cash assistance, but also like thinking more broadly we need our families to just have what they need, right? Like people go through crisis and they need to have that base level of wealth that offers them a little bit of like choice in what they're going to do when there's a crisis. Imagine that people had choices about what to do with their lives, right? And so like I think yes, and let's figure out a way. There are lots of ideas already. Let's figure out a way to make sure that folks have just kind of that basic cushion so that they're able to survive for a couple weeks before they can get through whatever red tape they need to get through in these systems that we haven't quite invested in making sure that they're like efficient and effective for people. Let's make sure that people have a cushion so that they can make some different choices.
Hi. Oh, okay. It happened to everyone and it still happened to me. Yeah, so I'm really enjoying the panel. Charles Kahn. I work at the Center for Popular Democracy running tax campaigns. And I work across like federal campaigns and state campaigns. And Jessica, you talked to this a little bit, but I think with the recession, there is, and with all federal policy, there's sort of a really large divide between a very well-intentioned and relatively well put together policy at the federal level and what happens at the state level. And in trying to tell the story of what happened with this recession, it can be very difficult at the state level because it seems like so much of the most successful and most impactful recession policy were the policies that that the federal government could fund and implement themselves. That's what people felt. They're like, I got a check, I got some masks, I got a test, I got a vax. You know, even to some degree, the unemployment benefits were, you know, the federal government a huge part. But like, what could we be doing? Because that state divide is like a very huge problem, and it makes some of the stories that you know Biden will try and tell or that are told federally seem authentic because they were so different at the state level. Like, what could we be doing at the state level to try and, you know, besides funding state organizations, what else could we be doing to try and close that divide and create like a more aligned process for how federal policy is landing at the state level?
There's more nuanced answers to this, but one is just have fewer state programs, just have more federal administration of programs. You think of the programs that are successful and have grown, Social Security, Medicare, they're federal. You know, Medicaid was made more federal through the ACA, pulled back by the Supreme Court and still ongoing. There was a divide put in during the New Deal. During the New Deal in the 1930s to make the program that were for white male workers federal and the programs that were not state. And there's a pretty good history on this across a lot of different things. And, you know, you look at the programs that did not do well, you know, they're administered by states such that states that don't want them to work well, don't work well. You see that with TANF, you see that with so many different things. So there's a lot of programs we should just be running at the federal level. And especially as things roll on, new programs are implemented. You think, you know, the CTC, that's a federal program, you know, doing your taxes for you, that will be a federal IRS program when and if it happens. So that's one thing I'd always emphasize is like fight the battle where we can win it strategically. And that's traditionally the federal government has the ability to create a more, going back to Reconstruction, a more egalitarian set of administrative apparatus than the state and municipalities ever will.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think we need a different story. We need a different American story on what we're willing to accept and not accept, right? Like we as Americans should not be willing to accept that anybody is unhoused, that anybody lives in poverty, that anybody is struggling to keep the lights on and food on the table and pay for childcare. Like that should just be, we need to have a different story where that is not acceptable. Right. And so however that happens, whether it happens through federal intervention or state intervention, like that to me is what the mobilizing organizing unit should be, is like everybody deserves because they are human. What about that? Right. Because we have these conversations around like who is deserving and who is not deserving and they need to work for it. Right. But how about you're a human being, so you deserve to have your basic needs met. And that needs to happen through government intervention, right? And I think if that is our storyline, if that is our base point, then the racism and the sexism that happens at the state level, because which are the states that don't do it well? Like, let's be real. It's the southern states. It's the states that have the most anti-blackness happening. Not that it's not a national phenomenon. It is, but like, that's what this is, right? And again, we need to be talking about root causes, and we need to have a different conversation about what we as Americans are willing to accept and what we're not willing to accept. And I think that helps, and in addition to the stuff that Mike is talking about.
And I also think there needs to be more communication just across the like federal and state kind of policy or organizing groups. I think one really important thing is that we listen to what's going on in communities, right? When we're like, for the folks that are in DC and are having these conversations, that we're listening and we're pulling people in, and we're always saying like, well, actually, have you talked to such and such? They're in this place. And what they said to me was that they're having trouble accessing these resources. And so like, you need to talk to them to understand how to better implement these policies. And also that we're just remaining watchful of and always thoughtful about who's going to get left out, because people will be left out. So the like nature of how our policymaking process works is that like it's not supposed to include the most vulnerable populations. And so always thinking about like where are the gaps, who's not going to get the resources that they need unless we pull them into these conversations. I think that's really important.
I'm going to end us there so that we make it to lunch on time, even though I know there's some more questions in the audience. So hit them up after this panel. But thank you so much to our three panelists. And this was a really fascinating conversation. Thank you for fantastic questions and for coming.
Thank you, Bryce.
Thank you.